So one of the things that I sometimes get asked is, what is Amrita? What is Amrita? So this is a Sanskrit term. It means nectar. It also means immortal. And it has its equivalent in Greek, which is ambrosia, or the nectar of the gods. And so this is a substance that can be produced in the human body. So it's quite a fascinating aspect of the human biology, and an aspect of the process of spiritual awakening. And so I remember being in India about 18 years ago, and I was doing quite an intense period of practice. I was in South India, in Kerala, practicing yoga several times a day. And I'd just finished one meditation session, and I lay down at the end of the session. I was lying on my back in Shavasana, and then I noticed a bead of sweat come out of the top of my head, middle of the crown, and it rolled forwards. It rolled forwards to the center of my forehead. And so I was lying on my back. I was in a state of ecstasy. I was in bliss after my meditation practice. And so in that ecstatic state, simply noticing this happening, and the actual experience of it was ecstatic as well, that I could feel ecstasy in this bead of sweat. And because I was lying on my back and this bead of sweat was rolling from the center of my head to my forehead, I noticed that it was actually moving away from the force of gravity. And I remember the thought arising, Newton got it wrong. Yeah, Newton got it wrong. So Newton was the guy that observed the apple, or supposedly, as the story goes, he observed an apple falling from a tree, and he worked out that there must be a force, and he called it gravity. And so this bead of sweat was not following the laws of gravity. So I was quite intrigued, I was quite interested. And then after that it began to happen more often, usually after or during spiritual practices, and the beads became more common, happening more frequently. And so after some sessions or during some sessions there would be constant beads being produced, and they feel like honey. They feel like ecstatic honey dripping from the crown of the head. And they don't always go forwards to this third eye. They sometimes come down the side. So sometimes they can actually come out of the Bindu chakra, which is a minor chakra going towards the back of the head. They can also come out of the third eye, out of Ajna chakra, and roll down. And they're always ecstatic, they're always intoxicating. So what I was actually experiencing was the production of Amrita, the sort of divine nectar that can be produced from the practice of yoga. And gradually, as the years passed, the individual beads of sweat would become so constant that they're more like streams, more like rivers of Amrita pouring down. And they would come down further than the third eye. They would come down to the throat and be reabsorbed into the body. They would come down to the heart and be reabsorbed into the body. And so what's happening? How does this substance get produced, and what's going on in the body? So this substance is a kind of byproduct of the Kundalini process. So it won't be produced until Kundalini is active in the body, and Kundalini has to be quite strong. The upward current, especially, of Kundalini, moving up through the central channel, has to be strong. And what happens is that this upward flow of Kundalini produces a kind of draw. It produces a kind of pull on sexual essences and sexual fluids in the body. Okay, so sexual essences and sexual fluids in the pelvic area are drawn upwards in the body simply by the rising current of Kundalini. And on a practical level, semen in men is actually drawn up into the bladder. So that's a physical aspect of this process. And the same thing happens for women. Sexual fluids are drawn up her body into the bladder. And then there's a kind of etheric aspect that takes over. So then things happen just on a purely energetic level. And what actually happens is quite fascinating. Prana from the sexual fluids and sexual essences is taken up into the Manipura chakra. That's the third chakra at the solar plexus. At the same time, we actually begin swallowing air. This very strange thing happens when we start swallowing air. The body is taking air deliberately into the stomach, and so the air contains prana, and then prana is taken from the stomach into the Manipura chakra. And then there's another aspect to this, which is that when we eat food, prana is taken from the food into the Manipura chakra as well. So we've got all these different pranas mixing in the third chakra at the solar plexus. And we can actually feel this mixing taking place, when we become sensitive to the movements of energy in the body. We can feel this happening. And this is why in some cultures the third chakra is referred to as the cauldron, the mixing pot. So you've got these pranas mixing. And then this mixing produces a substance called soma. This is another etheric substance, so it doesn't have a physical counterpart. And that's drawn up through the energy channels into the head. The Amrita is then produced in the head and then flows down from there. And there's another aspect to this Amrita where the Amrita can actually come down inside the skull, inside the nasal cavity, and then it comes down the throat and into the belly. So you've got two different ways in which the Amrita can move downwards once it's been produced. And there is one another physical counterpart of Amrita, which is actually an oil which is produced on the forehead. So as the Amrita is being produced, you can feel the drops coming down. You can actually feel oil on the forehead. And if you've heard the term anointed, so that's what this is referring to. An anointed person is anointed with oil. They're producing Amrita. And so this is kind of a fairly high level in the process of spiritual awakening. So Kundalini has to be active already for this to be happening. Kundalini has to be strong already for this to be happening. There's another aspect to this which is to do with losing energy through sexual activity. Basically, if we're either losing energy or actual sexual fluids, then this process won't take place. The energy will simply be lost downwards and outwards. The sexual fluids are simply lost outwards, and the Amrita can't be produced. And so there has to be a degree to which we're both retaining sexual energy and retaining sexual fluids in our body. So that's another aspect that we have to be aware of. So this is a very beautiful part of the process of yoga, and a very blissful part of the process of yoga. And it actually works in two ways in terms of spiritual purification. So we have to reach a certain level of spiritual purification before this process begins to happen. But once it's happening, it will cause the body to purify. So there's like a two-way thing going on. Spiritual purification from various practices will eventually cause this to happen. And once it's happening, it will be purifying the energy channels simply through the flow of Amrita in those channels. And so you'll see references in yogic texts saying things like 1 drop of Amrita is the equivalent of so much meditation practice. And so that's what that's referring to. And so if you experience this beginning to happen, in your body, don't be surprised, and it's a sign that good things are happening, and you can simply allow it to happen.